Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Let's do an update on the spreading campus protests against Israel. After 100 people were arrested at the University of Southern California, USC has now canceled its commencement ceremony. And at the encampment at Columbia University in New York City, where some of this had begun, the administration gave protesters a midnight Thursday deadline to disperse and seems now to have pushed that. Here's the update from administrators at 11 p.m. It says the talks have shown progress and we are continuing as planned. University senators have been in dialogue with student organizers to discuss the basis for dismantling the encampment. A formal process is underway and continues. And then it says this, Kim, there's a rumor that the NYPD has been invited to campus this evening. This rumor is false. And so my understanding is, as we're taping this on Friday, the encampment is still there. Maybe the formal process that was described there, negotiations are still underway, Kim.
Yeah, we don't know. We're going to have to watch this as it unfolds. But I think there's going to become a moment here. It does not look as though any of these kids that are out there are going to disband without a requirement that they do so, which may well involve the police. And I appreciate that there are negotiations going on, but even as those are happening, these are swelling, they're getting larger, and they're getting rowdier as well, too. You know, we're having more instances of confrontations because that's what happens when you have large crowds and when tempers are running at high levels. So we're going to see what they do to take care of this. But what's becoming incredibly clear is that campuses that did not deal with this and nip it in the bud when it first started and just made clear that this kind of behavior is not going to be tolerated on the campus and that those who engage in it actually will be subject to quite severe consequences. This is the natural outcropping of that. And we're now having, the University of Southern California just announced that they were canceling their entire commencement address. And I appreciate that there are some additional issues there at USC about their commencement speaker that was asked not to speak, et cetera. But there's a lot of kids that are on that campus that have no stake in this or not interested in this, who have spent 4 years working hard on a degree, and their parents are not going to be able to come and see them graduate at this point. And it's really just appalling that these administrators are so focused on the kind of rabble in the middle of their campus and how to treat this gently that they are ignoring the real responsibility of their university, its mission, and the kids that have remained faithful to it.
Let's take a couple letters from listeners on this topic. First, Ron says, one easy way for the administrators to consider how they should develop their speech codes or how to respond to intimidating or non-peaceful protests is to hypothetically swap out the causes. For example, if the protesters were a group of neo-Nazis or KKK members and they were harassing or intimidating certain groups of students, how would the university respond? How would they interpret their speech codes? What free speech guarantees would they want to ensure are protected? It's hard to imagine the answer would be the same as what they're currently implementing. That is some food for thought. And then here is Chad, who says, one of you said that limiting protesters' speech wasn't a First Amendment issue, but I'm afraid that's not true. When I was working on my degree, we had a hate preacher who would set up in the square at the center of campus and essentially heckle anyone who passed by. I talked to the administrators about it, and they informed me that because they take students who were there on government-backed student loans, they were required to allow him to set up and spew his hateful rhetoric. And Monet, my understanding is that the First Amendment is content neutral, but that it does allow restrictions on time, place, and manner of speakers is the phrase that you sometimes hear in the constitutional literature. And so my understanding is what that means is that if a public university allows person A and person B to set up a soapbox on the quad between certain hours, then this kind of hate preacher can do the same. But I think that what's happening at Columbia is different because I think the administration's position is that it has rules like no camping overnight on the quad might be one, and that the protesters in the encampment is not following the rules that have been set out, which are content neutral and apply to all protesters, no matter what their cause is. So when the NYPD was initially called in, here is what the president of Columbia said. She said Columbia had adjusted its policies on protest, and the current encampment violates all of the new policies, severely disrupts campus life, and creates a harassing and intimidating environment for many of our students, unquote. So, Monet, my understanding is that Columbia, whatever the results of this kind of negotiation, it seems odd to me that you're having a negotiation with people who are breaking your rules and disrupting your campus life and the orderly operation of your university. But be that as it may, whatever the result of these negotiations, Columbia is within its rights and within the First Amendment to clear this encampment from its campus so that the regular business of the university can continue.
Well, without a doubt, the time, place, and manner restrictions on protesting are well established. And in the case of Columbia, a private university, or even a public university, they have within their own charters or within their own rules as universities certain restrictions on exactly what protesters have to do in order to be allowed. They have to register usually to be able to take part in a protest. They have to be confined to certain areas, and generally it has to be within a certain period of time, and it can't disrupt the ordinary ongoings of campus life, not to talk of going out of their way to harass and threaten students and leading classes to have to be made remote for the remainder of the year. And so they've gone way beyond what the general restrictions are on what a protest protected by the First Amendment would be. And Columbia is very much within its rights to call in the NYPD to help to restrain and end those protests. To Chad's question about the hate preacher, I would ask, was that preacher there day after day after day? Was he disrupting students from being able to go to class or merely advertising a hateful, obnoxious opinion, but doing so in a way that was much more limited? And I think that is a big contrast between a lot of the protests that we've historically seen and tolerated and the ones that we see on campuses today in which law enforcement is being called in. And I think generally these universities have made a very bad bet in thinking that when this current wave of protests popped up, that it would fizzle in the same way that the first round right after October 7th did. They knew that they were disruptive. They knew they couldn't go on forever, but they were hoping that they'd go away without them having to actually use any force to clear them out. But as Kim mentioned, the longer they've let them go on, they've really made it hard to make the argument that they're doing this for good and clear reasons, and they've shown themselves to be very weak. And now it's going to be perhaps a much uglier and longer process to clear them ultimately, and we can only hope that will be a lesson to nip these sorts of things in the bud before they become entrenched when we see future disruptive protests of this kind.
Thank you, Monet and Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.